where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You know what's worse than losing everything you've ever worked for? Losing it in front of hundreds of people who'll never let you forget it. Here's something nobody tells you about life. You can do everything right, follow every rule, meet every expectation, prepare for years, and still end up with nothing. Actually, scratch that. Not nothing. You end up with something worse than nothing. You end up as a cautionary tale, a piece of gossip, the tragic story people whisper about at parties. And the most twisted part? Society will find a way to make it your fault. She must have done something wrong, they'll say. There must have been signs she ignored. Well, yeah, there were signs. But when you've invested your entire life into one future, your brain will perform Olympic-level gymnastics to protect that investment, even when the truth is staring you right in the face. This is the story of Lady Victoria, a woman who was promised to a duke before she could even walk, who spent 22 years preparing for one specific day, only to have that day become her absolute worst nightmare. But here's why you need to hear this. Because it's not really about a wedding or a duke or even betrayal. It's about something way more important. What happens when the life you planned disintegrates? When the person you trusted most stabs you in the back? When you have to choose between dying slowly in your pain or finding the courage to become someone completely new? And if you've ever felt like you've wasted time on the wrong person, invested in the wrong dream, or stayed in something way longer than you should have because starting over felt impossible, then you're gonna want to hear how this ends. Because Victoria's story isn't just about what she lost. It's about what she found on the other side of losing everything. Lady Victoria had been told since she could walk that this day would come. Every etiquette lesson, every dance practice, every carefully chosen word at dinner. It was all leading to this moment with Duke Alexander Ashford. Their families had signed the agreement before she'd even spoken her first sentence. It wasn't just a wedding she was preparing for, you see. It was her entire purpose, the enigma of her existence wrapped in silk and tradition. She'd wake at dawn to practice her posture, study French until her head ached, learn which fork to use for which course. And honestly, she'd embraced it. There was a strange comfort in knowing exactly what your life would be, even if you hadn't chosen it yourself. Think about it, like training for the Olympics your whole life. You're up at 5 a.m. every single morning, following a strict diet, sacrificing friendships and fun because you've got your eyes on that gold medal. Every muscle memory, every technique drilled into you until it's second nature. That's what Victoria's preparation felt like. Except the competition was her own wedding day, and losing wasn't supposed to be an option. She'd rehearsed her vows so many times they'd lost meaning, become just sounds her mouth made. The conspiracy of it all was that everyone around her acted like this was love, like this arrangement between the Ashfords and her family was somehow romantic. But she'd learned to play along, to smile at the right moments, to blush when expected. The morning of the wedding, Victoria remembers everything with painful clarity. The weight of the dress. God, that dress must have weighed 20 pounds, with all the beading and lace her mother had insisted upon. The scent of the roses they'd woven into her hair, so strong it made her dizzy. Her hands were shaking so badly that Margaret, her loyal maid, had to tie the corset 3 times before getting it right. "It's just nerves, my lady," Margaret had whispered. But something felt off, didn't it? There was this hidden feeling in Victoria's chest, this whisper of doubt she couldn't quite name. She'd pushed it down, told herself every bride feels this way. After all, She'd been preparing for this moment with Alexander for 22 years. Surely she knew what she was doing. Her father, Lord Edmund, had come to her room an hour before the ceremony, and Victoria will never forget what he said. "You've made us proud," he told her. "Not, 'I'm proud of you,' but 'you've made us proud.' There's a difference there, see? One's about you, the other's about what you've done for everyone else." He'd handed her a necklace that had belonged to his mother, this beautiful sapphire thing that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. "Every woman in our family has worn this on her wedding day," Lord Edmund had said. The trace of all those women who'd come before her, who'd also married for duty rather than choice. Victoria had worn it proudly, though. At that moment, she'd wanted nothing more than to belong to that legacy, to prove she was worthy of becoming the Duchess of Ashford. The Ashford estate was decorated like something out of a fairy tale. Thousands of white flowers, candles everywhere, musicians who'd traveled from Vienna just for this occasion. Guest lists that read like a who's who of European nobility, all coming to witness Victoria's union with Duke Alexander. Everything was perfect, orchestrated down to the last detail. She'd walked through it all during rehearsal, counted her steps, memorized where to pause, where to turn, where she'd meet Alexander's eyes. It was all mapped out, this grand performance she'd been rehearsing her entire life. And you know what's wild? Part of Victoria actually believed that if she did everything perfectly enough, if she played her role flawlessly, maybe real love would follow. Maybe the silence between her and Alexander would eventually fill with genuine affection. But here's what nobody tells you about preparing for something your whole life. You become so focused on the preparation that you forget to prepare for it not happening. Victoria had learned 17 different ways to address foreign dignitaries, but not one way to handle rejection. She could recite poetry in 3 languages, but didn't know how to ask for what she actually wanted. The secret everyone was keeping, including herself, was that this wasn't about love at all. It was about land, titles, and alliances between the Ashfords and her family. 2 powerful houses merging their power, and she was just the pretty seal on the contract. Deep down, Victoria knew this. But knowing something and accepting it, those are 2 completely different things. As Victoria stood in that preparation room, looking at herself in the mirror for the last time, before walking down that aisle to meet Alexander, she'd had a thought she'd never dare say out loud. What if I just left? It flashed through her mind like lightning, grabbing her skirts and running, disappearing into some lost corner of the world where nobody knew her name, her duty, or her promised duke. But the thought vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the sound of the orchestra starting up downstairs. "It's time, my lady," Margaret announced softly. And with that, Victoria took a breath, lifted her chin the way she'd been taught, and prepared to walk toward what she thought was her destiny with Duke Alexander Ashford. She had no idea that in less than 3 hours, everything she'd ever known would crumble, and she'd wish she'd listened to that forbidden voice inside her that had whispered, "Run." Looking back now, Victoria realizes the signs were everywhere. She just didn't want to see them. You know how sometimes you're driving down a road and there are warning signs everywhere saying, "Danger ahead," or "Bridge out," but you keep going because you've already committed to the route? That's exactly what she did with Alexander. There were these little moments, these tiny revelations that something wasn't right, but she'd brush them off like dust on her sleeve. The way he'd look past her during conversations, how he'd always find an excuse to cut their meetings short, the hidden distance in his eyes even when he was standing right next to her. She'd tell herself he was just nervous or busy, or that arranged marriages always start cold before they warm up. The first real sign came about 6 months before the wedding, during a garden party at the Ashford estate. Victoria had arrived early, excited to spend time with Alexander, maybe even have an actual conversation that wasn't scripted by their parents. She'd walked around the corner of the rose garden and stopped dead in her tracks. There he was, Alexander, laughing, actually laughing, with her younger sister, Beatrice. And it wasn't just polite laughter. You understand? It was genuine, the kind that comes from your belly, the kind that makes your eyes crinkle. Victoria had never heard him laugh like that with her. Not once in all their years of knowing each other. She'd felt this strange twist in her stomach, this enigma she couldn't quite solve, but she'd pushed it away. They're just talking, she'd told herself. Don't be paranoid. Then there were the letters. Oh, God, the letters. Alexander was supposed to write to Victoria once a week. It was part of their arrangement, keeping the connection alive between visits. But his letters were always so formal. Dear Lady Victoria, I hope this correspondence finds you in good health. The weather here has been most agreeable. That kind of thing. Meanwhile, she'd pour her heart into her responses, trying to create some kind of conspiracy of intimacy between them, trying to build something real. She'd write about books she was reading, thoughts she was having, dreams she had for their future together. His responses never changed. Always polite, always distant, always perfectly proper, and completely empty. One time, she'd tested him. She'd written about visiting Paris, a city she'd never been to, just to see if he was even reading them. He'd responded with, "How lovely that you enjoyed Paris." He wasn't even paying attention. The really painful sign came during their last private dinner before the wedding, about 2 weeks prior. Victoria had worn her best dress, the emerald one that brought out her eyes, and she'd practiced what she wanted to say to him. She'd wanted to have a real conversation, to break through that wall between them, to address the silence that had always existed. She'd asked him, with genuine vulnerability, "Alexander, are you happy about our marriage? Truly happy?" And you know what he did? He'd looked at her like she'd asked him about the weather. "It's a good match," he'd said flatly. "Our families will benefit greatly." Not, "Yes," not, "I'm looking forward to building a life with you," just business talk. She'd felt something break inside her chest at that moment, but she'd smiled and nodded and changed the subject. Because what else could she do? Here's the thing that haunts Victoria most. Beatrice had tried to warn her. Her younger sister, just 17 years old, had come to her room 3 days before the wedding. Victoria remembers Beatrice standing in the doorway, wringing her hands, looking like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Victoria," she'd started, her voice shaking. "I need to tell you something about—" But Victoria had cut her off. She'd been in the middle of final dress fittings, stressed about seating arrangements, drowning in last-minute details. "Not now, Bea," she'd snapped. "I have 1,000 things to handle. Whatever it is can wait until after the wedding." The trace of guilt on Beatrice's face should have told her everything. But Victoria was too wrapped up in her own world to notice. That moment plays over and over in her mind now. What if she'd just listened? Even the staff knew something Victoria didn't. Margaret, her maid, would get this look on her face whenever Alexander's name came up, like she wanted to say something but was forbidden from speaking. The Ashford servants would whisper and fall silent when Victoria walked by. Once, she'd overheard 2 maids talking in the hallway. "Poor thing doesn't know, does she?" one had said. "Know what?" Victoria had asked, stepping into view. They'd gone pale and stuttered something about the flower arrangements before scurrying away. She'd stood there in that hallway, feeling this creeping sense of disappearance, like the ground beneath her was less solid than she thought. But even then, even with that direct moment, she'd told herself she was being paranoid. After all, servants always gossip, right? The final sign, the one she really should have paid attention to, happened the night before the wedding. There was a traditional dinner where both families gathered, and Alexander had been late. When he finally arrived, his hair was slightly messed up, his collar askew, and he had this look on his face. Guilty. That's the only word for it. He'd looked guilty, flushed, like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't. And when he'd taken his seat at the table, Victoria had noticed him glance at Beatrice, just for a second, just this quick flash of eye contact, and her sister had turned bright red and looked down at her plate. The conflict in Victoria's mind was immediate. Acknowledge what she was seeing or protect herself from the truth. She'd chosen protection. She'd convinced herself it meant nothing, that she was reading too much into innocent interactions. And that's the real tragedy of it all, isn't it? When you've invested everything into one future, one path, one outcome, your brain will do Olympic-level gymnastics to protect that investment. Victoria could have saved herself so much pain if she'd just trusted her gut, if she'd followed those breadcrumbs of evidence to their logical conclusion. But she didn't want the mystery solved because she was terrified of the answer. She'd rather walk into a disaster than admit she'd wasted years preparing for something that was never really hers. It's like when you're in a relationship and you know something's wrong, but you keep going because the alternative is starting over. And starting over feels impossible when you've already committed so much. That was Victoria's mistake. And in just a few hours, during what should have been the happiest moment of her life, she'd pay the price for every sign she'd ignored. The music started, and Victoria's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone in the cathedral could hear it. She stood at those massive oak doors, her arm linked through her father's, looking down that impossibly long aisle decorated with white roses and candlelight. Hundreds of faces turned to look at her. Nobility from across Europe, all dressed in their finest, all waiting to witness this grand union. At the end of that aisle stood Alexander, tall and handsome in his formal attire, the Duke she'd been promised to since birth. This was it. Everything she'd prepared for. And yet, as the doors opened fully and that wedding march began, Victoria felt this strange disappearance of certainty, like something fundamental was about to shift. She took that first step forward, then another, each one feeling heavier than the last. About halfway down the aisle, Victoria noticed Alexander wasn't looking at her. His eyes kept darting to the side, to where the bridesmaids stood, specifically to where Beatrice stood in her pale pink dress. Victoria's stomach dropped, but she kept walking because what else could she do? Stop in the middle of the cathedral and run? All these people were watching, expecting, waiting for the fairy tale to unfold. She forced a smile, the one she'd practiced 1,000 times, and continued toward her groom. When she finally reached the altar and stood beside Alexander, he barely glanced at her. The priest began speaking in Latin, those ancient words that had joined countless couples before them, but Victoria couldn't focus. She could only hear the pounding of her own heartbeat and feel the hidden tension radiating from the man beside her. Then it happened. The priest got to the part everyone knows, the moment that's supposed to be simple and beautiful. Do you, Duke Alexander Ashford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? The cathedral went silent. Victoria looked up at Alexander, waiting for the "I do" that would seal her fate. that would make everything she'd prepared for finally real. But Alexander's jaw was clenched tight. His face had gone pale, and he was staring straight ahead like he was facing a firing squad. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. People started shifting in their seats. Victoria felt her face getting hot, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped her bouquet. "Your Grace?" the priest prompted gently. And that's when Alexander did the unthinkable. He turned, not to Victoria, but to the congregation. His eyes found Beatrice standing there among the bridesmaids, and something passed between them that made Victoria's blood run cold. "I can't," Alexander said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Those 2 words, just 2 simple words, and Victoria's entire world shattered. "I'm sorry. I can't do this." The cathedral erupted in gasps and whispers, a wave of shock rolling through the pews. Victoria stood there frozen, her mind trying to process what was happening but coming up empty. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't part of any preparation. Her father stood up from his seat, his face turning purple with rage. Her mother looked like she might faint. But Victoria couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "What do you mean you can't?" Victoria heard herself say, but her voice sounded strange, distant, like it was coming from underwater. Alexander finally looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that was worse than hatred. Pity. "I'm in love with someone else," he said. And even though Victoria already knew, even though some part of her had known for months, hearing him say it out loud was like taking a punch to the stomach that expelled every bit of air from her lungs. "I've tried to fight it, tried to do my duty, but I can't marry you when my heart belongs to another." The conspiracy of it all, the secret that everyone seemed to know except her, was finally being laid bare in front of hundreds of witnesses. And then he said the words that would haunt Victoria for the rest of her life. "I'm in love with Beatrice." The cathedral exploded into chaos. People were standing, shouting, some trying to leave, others crowding forward to get a better view of the scandal unfolding. But Victoria heard none of it. She was looking at her sister, her baby sister, who was standing there with tears streaming down her face, looking both terrified and relieved. Beatrice, her own sister. The trace of every strange interaction, every interrupted conversation, every guilty look suddenly made horrifying sense. Alexander walked past Victoria, literally walked past his bride at the altar, and went to Beatrice. He took her hand right there in front of God and everyone, and Beatrice didn't pull away. She held on. Victoria watched her sister, the girl she'd protected and loved and raised, choose the man who was supposed to be hers. It was like watching your own death in slow motion. Victoria's legs started to give out, and Margaret, bless her, appeared from nowhere to steady her. The priest looked absolutely horrified, fumbling with his Bible like maybe there was a scripture for this particular disaster. Victoria's father was yelling. She could see his mouth moving, see the rage on his face. But she couldn't hear the words. Everything had gone muffled, like her head was underwater. She looked down at herself, at this ridiculously expensive dress that had taken 6 seamstresses 3 months to make, at the sapphire necklace that represented generations of women who'd done their duty, and she felt the most powerful emotion wash over her. Not sadness, not anger, but this profound sense of forbidden shame. How could she have been so blind? How could she have missed something this obvious? Alexander and Beatrice were leaving, actually leaving, walking down the aisle together while Victoria stood abandoned at the altar. As they passed her, Beatrice whispered, "I'm sorry," which somehow made it worse. Sorry? Sorry didn't fix this. Sorry didn't erase the fact that Victoria's entire life, every plan, every dream, every carefully constructed future was crumbling in real time. The enigma of how this could happen, how her own sister could betray her like this, how Alexander could humiliate her in front of the entire aristocracy. It was too much to process. Victoria stood there at that altar, still holding her bouquet, still wearing that perfect smile that had frozen on her face, and realized that this moment would define her forever. She wasn't Lady Victoria, the future Duchess of Ashford, anymore. She was Lady Victoria, the girl who got left at the altar for her own sister. And every single person in that cathedral would make sure the world never forgot it. The worst part wasn't the moment itself. It was everything that came after. Victoria had to walk back down that aisle, past every single person who'd witnessed her humiliation, past the whispers and the stares and the barely concealed shock on their faces. Some looked at her with pity, which was somehow worse than mockery. Others couldn't even meet her eyes, like her shame was contagious. It's like when a video of you doing something embarrassing goes viral on social media, except this was happening in real life, in real time, and there was no delete button, no way to make it disappear. Every step she took felt like walking through fire, and she had to keep her head up, had to maintain that composure she'd been taught since childhood. A lady never shows weakness in public, her mother had drilled into her. Well, Victoria was about to test that theory to its absolute limit. The cathedral doors closed behind her, and she thought maybe, just maybe, she could collapse now. But no, there were carriages waiting, guests streaming out, servants everywhere. Her mother rushed to her side, but not to comfort her. "We need to do damage control," she hissed under her breath, already thinking about the scandal, about what this meant for the family's reputation. Her father was inside still, probably trying to salvage some kind of alliance with the Ashfords, though God knows what he could possibly say. Victoria stood there in the courtyard, still in that massive wedding dress, still holding those stupid roses, and watched as people climbed into their carriages, already gossiping. She could see their mouths moving, see the way they leaned in close to share the juicy details of what they'd just witnessed. The conspiracy of whispers spreading like wildfire. The secret that wasn't a secret anymore. The next few days were absolute hell. News traveled fast in aristocratic circles, faster than Victoria could have imagined. By the next morning, everyone knew. Everyone. She couldn't leave her room without encountering servants who'd suddenly become very interested in their shoes whenever she walked by. The mail brought letters, so many letters, some from concerned friends, most from nosy acquaintances, fishing for details. "I heard what happened, my dear. How are you holding up?" Translation: "Give me the gossip so I can share it at my next tea party." Victoria burned most of them without reading past the first line. What could she possibly say? "Yes, my groom left me at the altar for my 17-year-old sister. Thanks for asking." The trace of her destroyed engagement was everywhere she looked, every room holding some memory of her preparations. Then came the social events she couldn't avoid. Her first appearance was at Lady Thornberry's ball, about a week after the disaster. Victoria's mother had insisted, "You can't hide forever. Show them you're not broken." But Victoria was broken. She just had to pretend she wasn't. Walking into that ballroom was like walking into a gladiator arena. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when she entered. People literally turned to stare. She could feel their eyes on her like physical weight, could hear the hidden whispers, even though she couldn't make out the words. A group of young ladies she'd considered friends quickly dispersed when she approached, like her misfortune might be catching. One older duchess actually had the audacity to walk up to her and say, "Well, dear, at least you found out before the marriage was consummated." As if that was supposed to be comforting. The worst encounters were with people who wanted to compare their own stories, as if that would make Victoria feel better. "Oh, something similar happened to my cousin's friend once," they'd say, leaning in with fake sympathy. Or worse, the ones who tried to find the silver lining. "Perhaps it's for the best. Better to find out now than later." Victoria wanted to scream at them. There was no silver lining. There was no for the best. Her entire life had been preparing for one specific future, and that future had been ripped away in the most public, humiliating way possible. But instead of screaming, she'd smile, that perfect, practiced smile, and say, "How kind of you to say." Because that's what ladies do, right? They suffer in silence, maintain their composure, pretend the conflict raging inside them doesn't exist. Social invitations dried up almost immediately, which was its own special kind of torture. Suddenly, Victoria wasn't desirable company anymore. She was the girl with the scandal attached to her name, the walking reminder that even the most carefully planned futures could fall apart. Families with eligible sons avoided her like the plague. After all, if a duke didn't want her, what did that say about her worth? The mothers who'd once courted her friendship now steered their daughters away, as if Victoria's bad luck might infect them too. She went from being one of the most sought-after young women in society to being practically invisible. At events she did attend, she'd stand by the punch bowl alone, watching other girls dance, watching life continue for everyone else while hers had stopped dead. The disappearance of her social standing happened so fast, it gave her whiplash. Then there was the matter of Beatrice and Alexander. Because, of course, they didn't just disappear, they were everywhere. 3 weeks after the cathedral disaster, word spread that they'd gotten engaged. Engaged. As if what they'd done was romantic rather than devastating. And society, fickle as always, started treating them like some kind of tragic love story, like Romeo and Juliet instead of two people who'd destroyed Victoria's life. They couldn't help falling in love, people would say, as if that excused everything. As if Victoria's pain was just collateral damage in their grand romance. She'd see them at events sometimes. They'd have the decency to look uncomfortable at least, but people would flock to them, congratulate them, celebrate their triumph of true love. Meanwhile, Victoria stood in the corner, the forbidden topic no one wanted to acknowledge, the human cost of their happiness. The breaking point came at her own family's dinner party about 2 months later. Her parents, desperate to restore the family's reputation, had invited half of London's elite. Victoria had to play hostess, had to smile and make small talk and pretend everything was fine. One of the guests, Lord Pemberton, had too much wine and decided to be honest with her. "You know, Lady Victoria," he'd said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "perhaps if you'd been more attentive to your Duke, he wouldn't have strayed." Implying it was her fault. Implying she'd somehow driven Alexander to her sister. The enigma of how society could twist this narrative, how they could make her the villain or the failure in her own tragedy, hit her like a physical blow. She'd excused herself, went to the powder room, and for the first time since the cathedral, she'd let herself cry. Not delicate tears, but ugly, gasping sobs. And even then, even in that private moment, she'd had to muffle the sound because a lady never loses control. even when she's completely falling apart. After that dinner party disaster, Victoria made a decision. She was done. Done pretending. Done smiling through the pain. Done being society's favorite tragedy to dissect over tea and crumpets. She retreated to the family's country estate, claiming she needed time to recuperate, which was code for, "I can't face another pitying look or whispered comment without completely losing my mind." And honestly, isolating herself felt like the only sane choice. Think about it like a wounded animal retreating to its cave to heal. That's exactly what Victoria needed. A cave. Somewhere dark and quiet, where no one could see her fall apart, where she didn't have to perform strength she didn't feel. The secret was that she wasn't strong at all, and maintaining that facade was exhausting her more than the heartbreak itself. The first week of isolation was almost peaceful. Victoria would wake up whenever her body decided to wake up, sometimes noon, sometimes later, and she didn't have to apologize to anyone for it. No schedule, no expectations, no one watching her every move waiting for her to crack. Margaret would bring food to her room, and Victoria would eat maybe half of it before pushing the tray away. She'd spend hours just staring out the window at the gardens, watching the seasons change, watching life continue outside, while hers felt completely frozen. The hidden comfort of being alone was that she didn't have to explain herself, didn't have to justify why she couldn't just move on or be grateful it happened before the marriage. She could just exist in her pain, without commentary, without judgment. But here's what no one tells you about isolation. It protects you, sure, but it also becomes a prison. By the second month, Victoria realized she hadn't left her room in days. She'd stopped bathing regularly, stopped caring about her appearance, stopped doing pretty much anything except existing in this numb, gray space between sleeping and waking. Her beautiful gowns hung in the wardrobe untouched, while she wore the same nightdress for a week straight. The trace of the person she used to be, the polished, perfect Lady Victoria, was disappearing bit by bit, and she couldn't find it in herself to care. Margaret would try to coax her out. "Perhaps a walk in the garden, my lady. The roses are blooming." But Victoria couldn't face even that small amount of life, that small reminder that the world kept turning. The crying happened mostly in the bath, the only place where no one could hear her. Victoria would fill the tub with water so hot it almost burned, sink down until the water covered her ears, and just let it all out. The sobs would tear through her chest like something physical breaking, and she'd cry until she had nothing left, until she was just this empty, hollowed-out shell. She'd cry for the life she'd lost, for the sister who'd betrayed her, for the years she'd wasted preparing for a future that was never really hers. But mostly, she'd cry for the girl she used to be, the one who believed in duty and honor and happy endings. That girl was gone, drowned in that cathedral, along with all her carefully constructed dreams. The disappearance of her former self felt like a death, and she was grieving someone who'd never actually existed. Her parents tried to intervene, of course. Her mother would come to her door with increasingly frantic pleas. "Victoria, this isn't healthy. You need to rejoin society. Show them you're not defeated." But that was exactly the problem. Victoria was defeated. Completely, utterly defeated. And she was tired of pretending otherwise. Her father tried a different approach, coming in with talk of potential suitors, other alliances that could be formed. "Lord Ashworth's son is recently widowed," he'd suggested, as if Victoria was a piece on a chessboard that could just be moved to a different square. She'd looked at him with such emptiness that he'd actually flinched. "I'm not a bargaining chip," she'd said quietly. Not anymore. He'd left and didn't come back for 2 weeks. The real problem with isolation is that it gives you way too much time to think, to replay every moment, to torture yourself with what-ifs. What if she'd listened to Beatrice that day before the wedding? What if she'd confronted Alexander about the signs? What if she'd been prettier, more charming, more interesting? The enigma of why she wasn't enough consumed her thoughts like a poison. She'd lie in bed at night creating alternate timelines in her head, scenarios where she'd somehow won Alexander's love, where Beatrice had stayed loyal, where her life had gone according to plan. But morning would always come, and with it the harsh reality that no amount of wishful thinking could change what had happened. The conflict between the life she'd imagined and the one she was living felt impossible to reconcile. About 4 months into her self-imposed exile, something shifted. Victoria was having one of her marathon crying sessions in the bath when she caught sight of herself in the mirror across the room. She barely recognized the woman staring back, gaunt, pale, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that hadn't been properly brushed in God knows how long. And she had this sudden, crystalline thought. They've already taken everything from me. Am I really going to let them take this too? Am I going to let them turn me into this? It wasn't some grand epiphany, wasn't accompanied by swelling music or divine intervention. It was just a quiet realization that she had a choice: stay in this cave forever, letting the pain consume her, or find some way to crawl back into the light. The mystery wasn't why they'd done it to her. The mystery was whether she was strong enough to survive it. That night, Victoria did something she hadn't done in months. She got out of the bath, actually dried off properly, and put on clean clothes. She asked Margaret to bring dinner to the dining room instead of her bedroom. Small steps, you understand? She wasn't ready to face the world yet, but maybe she could start by facing herself. As she sat at that long dining table, alone but present, she made herself a promise. She didn't know how yet, didn't have a plan or a strategy, but she decided that Alexander and Beatrice had taken enough from her future, her reputation, her peace of mind. They weren't going to take her will to live too. The forbidden voice inside her that wanted to give up completely, she was going to fight it. Not because she was ready, not because the pain had lessened, but because somewhere deep down, buried under all that hurt, there was still a tiny spark of the person she used to be. And maybe, just maybe, that spark was worth protecting. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the rest of the mail that Victoria had been ignoring for weeks. It was from the Duchess of Marlborough, announcing her annual autumn ball, the social event of the season, the kind of gathering every member of the aristocracy attended. Margaret had brought it to Victoria's room along with breakfast, and Victoria had stared at that cream-colored envelope like it was a snake about to strike. 6 months ago, she would have been excited about this. 6 months ago, she would have already been planning her dress, her entrance, her dance card. Now? Now the very thought of walking into a ballroom full of people who knew her story made her physically ill. But here's the thing. She'd made herself that promise, hadn't she? That she wouldn't let them take everything. And hiding forever wasn't living. It was just a slower way of disappearing. Think about it like learning to swim after you've nearly drowned. You know you need to get back in the water eventually. Staying afraid of it forever means letting that one terrible moment control your entire life. But God, it's terrifying. Victoria held that invitation in her shaking hands and felt genuine fear coursing through her veins. What if people mocked her? What if Alexander and Beatrice were there? What if she walked in and every conversation stopped? Every eye turned to her, and she froze up completely. The enigma of how to face a world that had watched you fall apart was something no etiquette lesson had ever covered. But she also knew that if she didn't do this now, if she let fear win, she might never leave her room again. And that thought was somehow more terrifying than the ball itself. She spent 3 days preparing, which sounds ridiculous but was actually necessary. Victoria had to rebuild herself piece by piece, not into who she was before, but into someone new, someone who could carry the weight of what had happened and still stand upright. She started with the physical, proper baths, having her hair done, picking a dress that made her feel powerful rather than pretty. She chose a deep burgundy gown, something bold and unapologetic. Nothing like the soft pastels she used to wear when she was trying to be Alexander's perfect bride. She practiced walking in front of the mirror, practiced holding her head high, practiced that smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but conveyed, "I'm fine," convincingly enough. Margaret watched these rehearsals with tears in her eyes, understanding that what Victoria was doing took more courage than any battle. The night of the ball arrived faster than Victoria was ready for. She stood in front of her bedroom door for a solid 10 minutes, hand on the handle, heart pounding so hard she thought she might actually faint. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to claim illness, to retreat back to the safety of isolation. Her hands were sweating, her breathing shallow, and she could feel panic rising in her throat like bile. But then she thought about something her grandmother had told her years ago. Courage isn't the absence of fear, darling. It's being absolutely terrified and doing it anyway. So Victoria took a breath, opened that door, and walked down the stairs where her carriage was waiting. Each step felt like walking through mud, resistance pulling at her with every movement. But she kept going. The secret weapon she'd discovered was that courage wasn't something you felt. It was something you did, even when every fiber of your being wanted to run. The carriage ride to Marlborough House felt eternal. Victoria sat there in the darkness, watching London pass by through the window, and tried to remember who she was beneath all the pain. Not the girl who'd been left at the altar, not the sister who'd been betrayed, but the fundamental person underneath all that tragedy. The trace of her old self was still there. She could feel it, buried, but not dead. She remembered loving poetry, loving the way words could capture feelings too big for normal conversation. She remembered being kind, being thoughtful, being someone who cared about others. Those parts of her hadn't been destroyed. They'd just been buried under layers of hurt and humiliation. And tonight, she was going to see if she could dig them back up, even just a little bit. Walking into that ballroom was one of the hardest things Victoria had ever done. The moment she stepped through those doors, she felt the shift in energy, saw heads turn, heard that familiar drop in conversation volume. For a split second, she wanted to turn and run. But instead, she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked forward like she owned the place, like she hadn't spent the last several months crying in bathtubs and hiding from the world. The Duchess of Marlborough spotted her immediately and rushed over, and Victoria could see the surprise and approval in her eyes. "Lady Victoria," she'd said warmly, "how wonderful to see you." Not, "How brave of you to come," or, "I heard what happened." Just genuine warmth. And that small kindness was enough to steady Victoria's shaking hands. The evening was a test of endurance. Victoria had to make small talk with people who'd gossiped about her, had to smile at ladies who'd written her off as damaged goods, had to exist in a space where everyone knew her shame. she saw Lord Pemberton across the room, the man who'd blamed her for Alexander's betrayal. And instead of hiding, she walked right up to him and engaged him in conversation about his horses, calm as anything. She watched his discomfort with a small sense of satisfaction. She danced with a few gentlemen brave enough to ask, proving to herself and everyone watching that she wasn't broken beyond repair. Were her hands shaking the entire time? Absolutely. Did she want to leave every single minute she was there? Without question. But she stayed. She endured. She showed up. The real victory came near the end of the evening. Victoria was standing by the terrace doors, taking a moment to breathe, when a young woman approached her. Lady Caroline Hartwick, someone she'd only met briefly before. "Lady Victoria," Caroline had said quietly, "I just wanted to say what you're doing tonight, being here after everything. It's remarkable. My engagement ended badly last year, and I hid for months. Seeing you here makes me feel less alone in it." And in that moment, Victoria realized something profound. Her pain, her struggle, her choice to come back. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than that. The conspiracy of suffering in silence that society demanded was keeping everyone trapped. By showing up despite her fear, despite her pain, she was giving permission to others to do the same. The hidden truth was that everyone was fighting some kind of battle, and pretending otherwise just made everyone more lonely. Victoria left that ball before midnight, exhausted but oddly proud. She hadn't won anything, hadn't fixed anything, hadn't even particularly enjoyed herself. But she'd done it. She'd faced her fear and survived. And more than that, she'd proven something to herself, that she was stronger than what had happened to her, that her worth wasn't determined by Alexander's rejection or Beatrice's betrayal. She'd reclaimed a tiny piece of herself that night, and as her carriage rolled through the dark London streets toward home, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. Not the naive hope of her youth, not the belief that everything would work out perfectly, but the harder, more resilient hope that comes from surviving something you thought would destroy you. The forbidden feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was still a future worth fighting for, even if it looked nothing like the one she'd planned. And whether that ended up being with someone new or just with herself, Victoria finally understood that she was going to be okay. Not because someone had chosen her, but because she'd chosen herself. 3 months after that first ball, Victoria had settled into a new rhythm of life. She wasn't thriving exactly, but she was surviving, which felt like its own kind of victory. She'd started attending select social events, carefully choosing gatherings where she felt she could breathe, where the scrutiny wasn't quite so intense. She'd also started doing something unexpected, volunteering at a charity hospital in the East End, working with children from impoverished families. Her mother thought it was scandalous, beneath their station, but Victoria didn't care anymore about those kinds of rules. The secret she'd discovered was that helping others actually helped her. When she was bandaging a child's scraped knee or reading stories to sick patients, she wasn't thinking about Alexander or the cathedral or her shattered dreams. She was just being useful, being present, being something other than the girl who got left at the altar. It was at the hospital of all places that Victoria met him. Lord James Fitzgerald wasn't a duke or even particularly wealthy by aristocratic standards. He was a second son, which meant he'd inherited very little and had to actually work for a living. He'd become a physician, much to his family's horror, and spent most of his days treating people who couldn't afford fancy doctors. Victoria had noticed him before. Hard not to, really. He had this way of talking to patients, especially the children, that was so genuine and warm it made something in her chest ache. He didn't talk down to them or treat them like charity cases. He treated them like people, with dignity and respect, regardless of whether they could pay him. The trace of real goodness in him was so different from the calculated politeness of the aristocratic men she'd known her whole life. Their first real conversation happened over a patient, a little girl named Sarah who'd come in with a nasty infection. Victoria had been holding Sarah's hand while James cleaned and dressed the wound, and the girl had been crying, terrified of the pain. Without thinking, Victoria had started telling her a story, making up this elaborate tale about a princess who was actually a secret dragon rider. James had glanced up at her mid-story with this look of surprise and something else. Interest, maybe? When Sarah finally calmed down and fell asleep, he'd smiled at Victoria and said, "That was remarkable. You're a natural with children." Not, "That was remarkable for a lady of your station," or, "I wouldn't expect that from someone like you." Just a simple, genuine compliment. And Victoria, who'd become so used to every interaction being colored by pity or curiosity about her scandal, felt something shift inside her. They started talking after that, small conversations at first, about patients, about the hospital, about nothing particularly profound. But here's what was different about James. He didn't know her story. Or if he did, he didn't care. He never asked about Alexander, never brought up the wedding, never treated her like she was broken or needed to be handled with kid gloves. He just talked to her like she was a person, like she was interesting for reasons that had nothing to do with who'd rejected her or what scandal she'd survived. The enigma of it was refreshing in a way Victoria couldn't quite articulate. She'd become so used to being defined by her worst moment that having someone see her as just Victoria, not poor Lady Victoria or that Lady Victoria, felt like breathing fresh air after being underground for months. One afternoon, about 2 months into their friendship, James invited Victoria to take a walk through the hospital gardens during their break. It was nothing romantic, just two people who'd been working hard needing some fresh air and sunshine. They talked about everything and nothing. Books they'd read, places they'd traveled, dreams they'd had as children. James told her about wanting to open a clinic for the poor, about his family's disappointment in his career choice, about how freeing it was to disappoint people's expectations and just live according to your own values. And Victoria found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone else, sharing thoughts and feelings she'd kept locked away. Not about the wedding, they still didn't discuss that, but about who she was becoming, about the conspiracy of societal expectations and how exhausting it was to live up to them. There's this story about seeds that Victoria had heard once, about how a seed has to basically die, has to crack open and break apart, before it can become something new, before the plant can emerge. Sitting in that garden with James, talking about real things with someone who saw her as real, Victoria realized that's what had happened to her. The old Victoria, the one who'd been shaped entirely by duty and expectations and other people's plans for her life, had died in that cathedral. She'd been mourning that death for months, clinging to the ghost of who she used to be. But maybe that wasn't a tragedy. Maybe that breaking open was necessary for something new to grow. Maybe she'd needed to lose everything she thought she wanted to discover what she actually needed. The moment Victoria realized she was falling for James wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There was no lightning bolt, no sweeping romantic gesture. It happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday when she watched him spend 45 minutes coaxing a frightened child into taking medicine, using silly voices and making the kid laugh until the fear disappeared. Victoria stood in the doorway watching this brilliant, kind man who'd given up wealth and status to help people who couldn't give him anything in return. And she just knew. This was what love was supposed to feel like. Not the carefully orchestrated arrangement she'd had with Alexander, not the performance of affection they'd both been pretending at, but this quiet, steady certainty that this person made the world better just by being in it, and that she wanted to be around for that. But here's the beautiful, terrifying thing. Victoria didn't immediately act on that realization. The old Victoria would have panicked, would have tried to lock it down, secure it, turn it into something official and safe. But the new Victoria, the one who'd been broken and was slowly rebuilding herself, understood something crucial. She didn't need James to complete her. She didn't need another person to define her worth or give her life meaning. She was learning to be whole on her own, learning that her value didn't come from who wanted her or who didn't. The hidden gift that her suffering had given her was perspective. The ability to see that real love isn't about completing each other. It's about choosing to walk alongside someone who's already whole. And for the first time in her life, Victoria felt like maybe she was becoming that person. Not the perfect lady who'd been promised to a duke, not the broken woman who'd been left at the altar, but someone entirely new, someone who'd survived the worst thing she could imagine and discovered that, on the other side of that pain, was the possibility of something genuine, something real, something worth fighting for. And whether that ended up being with James, or with someone else, or with no one at all, Victoria finally understood that she was going to be okay. Not because someone had chosen her, but because she'd chosen herself. So here's the question I want you to sit with. How much of your life are you living for other people's expectations? How many years are you going to waste preparing for a future that might not even be yours? Because here's the brutal truth. Victoria spent 22 years becoming the perfect bride for a man who never really wanted her. 22 years. That's not just time, that's a whole life. And yeah, what happened to her was devastating, humiliating, the kind of pain that would break most people. But you know what the real tragedy would have been? If she'd stayed broken. If she'd let that moment define her forever. If she'd hidden in that room for the rest of her life, letting fear and shame win. The thing about rock bottom is that it gives you a choice. You can either stay down there, or you can use it as a foundation to build something completely new. Victoria lost everything she thought mattered. The Duke, the title, the carefully planned future, even her own sister. But in losing all that, she found something she never had before. Herself. Not the version of herself that other people needed her to be, but the real, messy, complicated, strong-as-hell woman underneath all those expectations. And that's the secret nobody talks about. Sometimes, the worst thing that ever happens to you is also the thing that sets you free. So let me ask you this. What are you holding on to that's already dead? What relationship? What dream? What version of yourself are you clinging to even though it's clearly not working? And more importantly, what would you do if you lost it all tomorrow? Would you hide? Or would you fight? Would you let it destroy you? Or would you let it transform you? Because here's what Victoria's story teaches us. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being absolutely terrified and choosing to live anyway. It's about taking that first step back into the world even when your hands are shaking. It's about deciding that the people who hurt you don't get to write the ending of your story. I want you to do something right now. Think about one thing. Just one thing. You've been too scared to do because you're afraid of what people will think. Afraid of failing. Afraid of starting over. Maybe it's leaving a relationship that's been dead for years. Maybe it's pursuing a dream. everyone told you was impractical. Maybe it's just showing up as your authentic self instead of the person everyone expects you to be. Whatever it is, I want you to ask yourself, am I really living, or am I just performing? Am I building a life I actually want, or am I building the life everyone else thinks I should have? Victoria's revenge wasn't against Alexander or Beatrice. It was against the fear they left her with. Her revenge was healing. Her revenge was choosing joy even after experiencing devastating pain. Her revenge was refusing to let one terrible moment define her entire existence. And honestly, that's the most powerful thing any of us can do. Not letting our worst moments win. Not giving the people who hurt us permanent real estate in our heads. Not staying small because someone once made us feel insignificant. So, what's it gonna be? Are you gonna keep playing it safe? Keep hiding? Keep waiting for permission to live your actual life? Or are you gonna take that terrifying first step toward becoming who you're actually meant to be? Because I promise you this. On the other side of your fear is a version of you that's stronger, wiser, and more alive than you've ever been. But you gotta be willing to walk through the fire to get there. You gotta be willing to let the old you die so the new you can be born. If Victoria's story resonated with you, if something in it made you feel less alone or gave you even a tiny bit of courage to face your own battles, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because we're just getting started with these stories, these real conversations about pain and transformation and what it actually takes to build a life worth living. Drop a comment and tell me, what's the one thing you're finally ready to let go of? What's the one step you're gonna take this week toward becoming who you're meant to be? Let's build a community of people who refuse to stay broken, who choose growth over comfort, who understand that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the beginning of your best life. I'll see you in the next one.